The night Harriet Solano walked into the Meridian Club's annual gala, nobody looked up. That was the point. She had spent 23 years in this city. Toronto, the kind of city that rewards whoever talks the loudest in the room, and she had learned slowly, the way you learn things that hurt, that being overlooked was not always a disadvantage. Sometimes it was a strategy. Sometimes it was a gift you didn't ask for but learned to use anyway. She checked her coat at the door and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. Around her, the ballroom was already humming. Bay Street money, tech founders who'd cashed out, a few politicians working the edges of the room. The Meridian Gala was the kind of event that mattered if you needed it to matter. Harriet didn't need it to. She came because she was asked to come, and because the man who asked her was the same man who had, 3 years ago, taken everything she built and put his name on it. That man was across the room right now. His name was Callum Reid. Not the Callum from the list, a different one entirely, one she had known for 9 years and trusted for 6 of them. He was standing near the bar in a charcoal suit, laughing at something the Meridian's board chair had said. Beside him was his new wife, a woman named Priya who worked in communications and had no idea, as far as Harriet could tell, what her husband had done. Harriet watched him for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned away and found her table. She had built Norlight Analytics in the back bedroom of a Leslieville row house, on a second-hand monitor and a whiteboard she'd bought at a yard sale for $6. That was 12 years ago, when she was 31 and newly divorced and so broke she was eating rice and frozen peas 4 nights a week. She didn't mind. She had an idea that kept her up at night. A predictive supply chain model that nobody in Canada was doing properly. Not at the level she was envisioning. Not with the kind of granularity that would actually matter to mid-size manufacturers. It took her 3 years to build the core system. Another year to get her first client. By the time she met Callum Reid at a business conference in Ottawa, Norlight had 6 clients and was profitable quietly, in the way that sustainable companies sometimes are before anyone notices them. Callum was a consultant then. Smart, quick, socially fluent in a way Harriet had never been and had mostly stopped trying to be. He understood rooms. He understood people. He could walk into a meeting with a potential investor, and within 8 minutes have them leaning forward in their chairs. Harriet could build the thing. Callum could sell it. It seemed at the time like a reasonable partnership. They structured it carefully, or so she thought. She held 51%. The intellectual property was registered in her name. The core algorithm, what she called the Norlight engine, the thing that actually made the platform work, was documented, time-stamped, and filed with her lawyer on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 years before Callum Reid ever heard her name. She should say this clearly. She was not naive. She knew what she was doing when she brought him in. She asked her lawyer twice if the structure was tight. She was told it was. What she didn't account for was the slow drift. The way Callum started referring to Norlight as our company in interviews, then the company I co-founded, then, in a piece in the Globe and Mail's report on business, the platform I built to solve a problem I saw in the manufacturing sector. She had been mentioned once in that article, in the 14th paragraph, as a technical collaborator in the early stages. She had read that paragraph 4 times, standing in her kitchen, coffee going cold on the counter. She hadn't said anything. She had told herself she was being strategic, picking her battles, waiting for the right moment. But if she was honest, and she tried to be, now, because dishonesty with yourself was how you ended up standing in the wrong place for too long. She had also still trusted him. Some part of her had believed he would correct it, that he would see the article and call her and say, "This isn't right, I'll get them to run a correction." He didn't call. The second time was worse because she had stopped being surprised, and that was its own kind of grief. Norlight had been acquired by a mid-sized logistics firm called Crestfield Group 18 months after the Globe piece. The acquisition meeting. The one where the Crestfield board asked foundational questions about the platform's origin, its architecture, its defensibility. Was a meeting Harriet had prepared for with 40 hours of documentation and 2 dry runs with her technical team. Callum had sat across the table from the Crestfield executives and answered every question as though the answers were his own memories. She had sat beside him. She had watched his hands on the table, the easy confidence, the way he made her 12 years of work sound like a story he had personally lived. Afterward, in the elevator going down, he had touched her arm and said, "You were great in there, really, you let me carry it and it worked." She had looked at the elevator doors. "I let you carry it," she had said, very quietly. "You know what I mean." She did know what he meant. That was the problem. The acquisition gave Callum 40% of the exit payout. Harriet received her 51%. On paper it looked correct. In reality, the terms had been negotiated with Callum as the primary point of contact, and several of the earn-out conditions were structured around his continued involvement with the platform rather than hers. Her lawyer had flagged it. She had signed anyway because she was tired, because she wanted it to be over, because she told herself the money was the money, and she could start fresh. She started fresh. She went to Vancouver for 8 months. She consulted quietly. She slept properly, for the first time in years. And then she came back and started building again. The firm she built this time had a different kind of structure. She called it Solano Advisory, which was simple, which was hers in a way Norlight had never been, or had been only in the beginning. She didn't bring in a sales partner. She hired a business development director named Winsome Achibi, who was 28 and precise, and had a gift for finding the right room without filling it unnecessarily. She also retained a different lawyer, a woman named Daphne Osi-Mensah, who had a reputation in Toronto's tech and IP community that Harriet had heard about for years and never thought she would need. Daphne had a way of looking at contracts as though she could see through them to the intentions underneath, and she had opinions about what Harriet told her, opinions she delivered without drama and without softening. The Norlight structure wasn't wrong, Daphne had said at their first real meeting. It was correctly documented and correctly filed. What happened to you was a slow erosion of narrative. That's harder to litigate but easier to prevent. How do you prevent it? Harriet had asked. By not needing anyone else to tell the story, Daphne had said. Harriet had thought about that for a long time afterward. Solano Advisory grew in the way that things grow when you stop managing other people's perceptions and focus entirely on the work itself. By the end of the second year, they had 14 enterprise clients across logistics, manufacturing, and distribution. By the end of the third, they had offices in Toronto and Calgary and a licensing deal with a European consortium that Harriet had negotiated herself, directly, without a middleman. She did not do interviews. She did not attend most industry events. When Solano's name appeared in the press, and it did, with increasing frequency, the stories were technical, specific, focused on outcomes rather than personalities. Harriet liked it that way. She had learned the hard way that a certain kind of visibility was not the same as a certain kind of power. She knew where she stood. She didn't need other people to announce it. What she did not know, not until 6 weeks before the Meridian Gala, was that Callum Reid had spent the past 2 years quietly claiming, in certain rooms, that the core architecture of Solano's platform was derived from the work he had done during his Norlight years. That he had been saying this, not publicly. He was too careful for that, but in the specific rooms where it mattered. In conversations with investors considering Solano's next raise, in sidebar discussions at conferences Harriet hadn't attended, in an email that had been forwarded to her, finally, by someone who thought she should know. She had read the email standing in the hallway outside her own boardroom. Then she had walked into the boardroom and finished her meeting and driven home, and sat at her kitchen table for a very long time without turning on any lights. Daphne, when Harriet called her, was quiet for a moment after hearing everything. Then she said, "Tell me you kept everything." "I kept everything," Harriet said. "Original development logs, version histories, the full IP registration file, from the beginning. I have the whiteboard photos. I have the early client emails asking about the model before I had a commercial product." Another pause. "Okay," Daphne said. "Then you don't have a legal problem, you have a perception problem. And that's solvable." "How?" Daphne told her. The Meridian Club's annual gala had for the past 6 years featured a segment called the Builder's Showcase. A 10-minute presentation given by a founder or executive that the Meridian board selected based on what they called demonstrated impact on Canadian enterprise. It was not televised, but it was attended by the kind of people whose attention mattered in certain industries. Harriet had been invited to present this year. She had accepted. Callum Reid had been invited as a general attendee. He was there because he still had social relationships in this world, because people in Toronto's business community had short memories, or had never been told the full story, because the slow erosion Daphne had described worked in both directions. It could erase credit, but it could also fabricate it. And he had been fabricating his for years. He didn't know when he arrived at the Meridian that night that Harriet would be presenting. She found that out from the gala's program coordinator, who mentioned it casually 3 weeks before the event, and she had simply said, "Oh, that's fine," and moved on. She presented at 9:15. She had not prepared slides. She had prepared something else. When Winsome walked her to the small presentation stage at the front of the Meridian's ballroom, a low platform, nothing theatrical, just a microphone and a screen, Harriet felt the familiar sensation she always felt in rooms like this. The awareness of being looked at, the slight tightening in her chest, and then, past it, the stillness that came when she focused. She thanked the Meridian board. She said she was grateful to be included. She said she was going to spend a few minutes talking about a problem that didn't get discussed often enough in Canadian enterprise circles, which was the problem of provenance. She said the word carefully. Provenance. Where things come from. She talked about the Norlight engine. Not by name, not yet. In technical terms, the kind of terms that made the non-technical people in the room go quiet because they could feel the precision even if they couldn't follow every detail. She described the architecture. She described what problems it solved and how she had solved it and what the original documentation looked like. She said, matter-of-factly, that she had developed this system over the course of 3 years, in a home office in Leslieville, and that the full development record, code commits, design documents, client correspondence, IP filings, was publicly available as of that morning through Solano Advisory's website and through her legal firm's records office. She paused. Then she said, I mention this because there has been some confusion in certain conversations about where this work came from. I want to be clear, it came from me. She said it the way you say something when you have stopped being afraid to say it. Quiet, level, entirely certain, the room had gone very still. She did not look at Callum, she didn't need to. She could feel, in the particular quality of the silence, that everyone who knew both of them was doing their own accounting. She said she was happy to take questions. She said that Solano Advisory's current work was building on the same foundational architecture, which was why they had been able to move so quickly and so specifically, and she named 3 client outcomes that were, by any measure in this room, extraordinary. She said thank you. She walked off the stage. Winsome was waiting for her with another glass of sparkling water. She handed it over without comment. How was it? Harriet asked. You'll know in about 4 minutes, Winsome said. It took 3. The first person to reach her was a man named Elliot Bryce, who ran Bryce Capital and who Harriet had met twice before briefly. He shook her hand with both of his and said he had heard of Norlight. He had not known the full story, and he would like to have a conversation when she was ready about Solano's next phase. Behind him, a woman Harriet recognized as the managing partner of a major logistics investment fund, was waiting. Behind her 2 more. Harriet answered their questions honestly and specifically, the way she had always answered questions when she was allowed to be the one answering them. Callum found her near the coat check at 10:45. She saw him coming and did not move. She had her coat already over her arm and she was saying goodbye to Daphne, who had attended as a guest and who noticed Callum approaching before it did and very slightly adjusted her posture in the way that lawyers do when they are ready. Harriet, Callum said. Callum, she looked at him. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe she was remembering wrong. Priya was not beside him. That was... He stopped. Started again. What was that? That was a presentation, she said. The Builder's Showcase. I was invited to present. You know what I mean. She had heard him say that before. She hadn't forgotten how it felt then. But she felt it differently now. Not as an appeal to shared understanding but as a small, tired attempt to make her responsible for his discomfort. I know what you mean, she said. And I want you to think carefully about your next sentence, because Daphne is standing right here and I have kept everything. He looked at Daphne. Daphne looked back at him with an expression that was professionally neutral and somehow also entirely clear. He didn't say the next sentence. Instead he said, I built things too, Harriet. I wasn't nothing. She looked at him for a moment. It was possible this was even true. He had opened doors. He had been in rooms. He had made phone calls that mattered. None of that was what he had claimed, but it was not nothing. I know, she said. But you took what was mine and you called it yours, and you kept doing it even when I wasn't there to see it. That's not a contribution. That's a theft. She said it the same way she had said everything else that evening. Without volume. Without performance. The way you say a fact. He didn't answer. Take care of yourself, Callum, she said, and she turned and handed her coat check ticket to the attendant. Outside, the November air had that specific Toronto coldness that doesn't announce itself, it just arrives. Harriet put on her coat and stood on the steps of the Meridian for a moment, looking at King Street. The streetcar tracks, the lit windows, the ordinary Thursday night movement of the city. Winsome came out a few minutes later, phone in hand. Elliot Bryce's office already emailed, she said. And the fund. She paused, and there are 2 other inquiries I don't recognize yet. Harriet nodded. You okay? Winsome asked. It was a genuine question asked by someone who knew that doing the right thing at the right moment doesn't necessarily feel triumphant. Sometimes it just feels like the end of a long carrying. Yeah, Harriet said. I think so. She looked at the street again. She had driven herself here tonight, a deliberate choice. She had wanted to be able to leave on her own terms. And her car was half a block east, and the night was cold and she was tired in the specific way of someone who has put down something heavy after holding it for a very long time. She walked to her car. She didn't look back at the Meridian. She had said what was true, in a room full of people who could hear it, with documentation to back it and a lawyer beside her and 12 years of time-stamped work on her side. That was enough. That was in the end exactly enough.